All right. Last topic in our last two chapters of the week on social influence, we talk about obedience. This is when we are told to do things and we then follow along. So let me start with an example that kind of illustrates the powerful power that obedience and orders, direct orders, have on us. So this is an example that, a real life example that happened about 150 years ago in Germany at the end of the 19th century. And in the middle, you see the protagonist of the story, Wilhelm Vogt. He was just released from prison. He had served several prison sentences for minor crimes, and he couldn't find any work. And at some point, he became so frustrated that he put on a captain's uniform, a Hauptmann uniform, as we say in Germany, and pretended to be a captain of the army. So he took on this uniform, then he went down on the street, and there passed a company of soldiers by, and he took over this company and said, like, okay, I'm now in charge. I'm giving the orders. You have to follow me. We have to go to the city hall you see on the right, and in the city hall he arrested, with the help of this army that he now, the small army that he now commanded, he arrested the mayor, and he also arrested the treasurer because he claimed they committed fraud and bribery, and now he took the money to himself and left. Unfortunately, 9 days later he was unfortunately 9 days later he was caught, and he had to serve another prison sentence, but he was pardoned by the Emperor of Germany at that time, Kaiser Wilhelm II, because he was so popular. His stunt was so popular. And his stunt was so popular. Then he, when he left the jail, he basically performed on stage for audience this stunt again, reenacted, explained how he did it and all the details, and this is how he made a livelihood thereafter. Often this is taken as a sign of how much Germans love to obey orders. But as you will see in the chapter today, it's not just Germans that love to obey orders. People in general love to obey orders, and this can have at times devastating effects. I think in a book, in the textbooks, when we read about it, we often think about orders that are terrible orders that are acted out, such as the Holocaust, killing of innocent civilians in any type of war, and you can find these kind of committed crimes in any type of culture all around the world. So we are, as social psychologists, trying to understand how can human beings do such terrible acts, and often the answer is that people say, I was just following orders. So just to kind of recap what we did so far and what we're going now to do is, what we see on the left corner, right, is the Ash and Conformity Experiments. We talked about this first, and then we talked about let me just quickly, then we talked about on here, we talked about compliance, where I asked to do something, and now we talk about the Milgram experiment, right? You might have heard of them. This is a picture of them, and this is about obedience, where we systematically studied, as social psychologists, how obedience, how orders influence our behavior. So Milgram's classic research, I think most of you might be familiar. I just want to remind you of all the details and kind of remind you how astonishing the results are, right? So here you actually see a participant on the left helping to set up the experimental paradigm. You also have a learner. This is a confederate, so a person that is pretending to be another participant. And you have the experimenter, the scientist. He's dressed in a white lab coat, which you can't see here very well, a figure of authority. He is the person who's giving orders. So the experiment, basically, the basic setup is that the experimenter explains to you that you are trying to understand better how pain influences learning. So we have a learner here. He's the learner, and you are the teacher. And he's, as a scientist, overseeing the experiment. So the learner would perform some tasks, and when he makes a mistake, you are ordered to give him an electric shock. And this is to study how these electric shocks are influencing learning and performance. So this is the basically setup. You will leave the room thereafter, you'll be in a different room, but you can hear what is happening to the learner and the delivery of the electric shocks via a microphone, and so you could hear what's happening in the room. This is also important as a setup because this is obviously involves deception. So the setup is fake. The person here, the learner, does not actually get the electric shocks, but he pretends to be shocked. And we will see in a second or in a minute exactly how he did that. So participants were 40 Yale male people who lived around Yale University or were in the vicinity of Yale, were recruited with flyers. You can see some of the pictures of one participant in the experiment as he has to go through the procedures. So this is the real shock machine. You can see basically, and this is important to kind of remember, you can see here at the beginning you have, this is where it starts, you have here the volt number, and not everyone understands what the volt number is, but then you have also these labels. It's hard to see here, and we'll come back to that, okay, which is danger, okay, death possible. So there are these red ones that kind of, that they're extreme, the shocks that are delivered are extremely dangerous to the life of the person who gets them. So they're labeled. There's not just the volt number, the strength of the shock, but there are also labels that try to help you to understand what kind of shock you're delivering, even if you don't understand the voltage. So that was obviously fake, yet I think if you look at it, very convincing. Doesn't look very fake, looks very real to me, and probably especially if you were in the 1960s. I do experiments, and I did experiments with electric shocks, and they don't look, the electric shock machines we use don't look that different. This is the protocol. So it's basically what the experimenter, as I told you, like the learner in the other room, he got a script. So whenever, let's say you're the participant, you would administer shock, and then he was, okay, at 75 volts, he's like, oh, okay. Then he would get louder with 105 shocks. With 120, he's like, oh my God, this really hurts, right? So everyone heard the same, oh, with 150 volts, experimenter, that's all, get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble, right? Heart trouble. He has problems with heart. My heart is starting to bother me now. Get me out of here. My heart's starting to bother me. I refuse to go on. Let me out. Okay. 160 watt. Let me out. 180 watt. I can't stand the pain. Let me out here. 195 volts. Let me out of here, please, let me out, my heart is bothering, let me out, and so forth. I just want to read out the last one before you get to the, basically here you can see, let me just highlight this, intensely agonized scream. I told you, I refuse to answer, I'm no longer part of this experiment. With 330 volts, he's like, let me out of here, my heart is bothering, let me out, hysterically, let me out, you have no right to hold me here, let me out, and so forth. And then after the last shock, you hear nothing. It sounds almost like the other person in the room collapsed. So this is just to remind you, you're sitting on the other end, and there's a person you can hear screaming, agonizing things to you, that they have heart trouble, etc. So this is not something where it's like an artificial situation where it's easy to kind of just press a button and it almost feels not real. No, they hear somebody screaming, okay? Another key ingredient in this experiment is that whenever the person delivered another shock, whenever the participant, if you would refuse to deliver another shock, then the experimenter would say one of these four things, right? The first thing is like, please go on or please continue. Then the experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on, right? You can see this here. Basically, the person's like, are you sure I should do that? And he's like, please go on. And he's like, I don't know. And there's like, the experiment requires you that you continue. You have no choice. You must go on. So these prompts is basically the orders, right? This is where the obedience comes in. So you want to refuse. You feel like this is not right. You should stop. And now the experimenter tells you with these prompts to go on. Before Milgram conducted his experiments, he went to a bunch of psychiatrists. He said, like, who are the people who are best to predict what people would do in such a situation? Why don't we talk to psychiatrists? And you can see here, this is the percentage of participants that they predicted would comply with the order. So they said, like, oh yeah, if there's a slight shock, if you kind of slightly shock the participant, yeah, I think about 80%, 83%, and then it drops steeply. And you can see here, I made a sign, nobody, I think they predict, you can't really see it, just like a tiny bit here, they predicted that 1 in 1,000 would actually administer that shock. So they would say 0.1%, okay, was the prediction. It would basically sound like, okay, from here on out, nobody would do it. This is a ridiculous experiment. Why would you do it? So let's have a look at the original results. So here we just oriented you. On the left, you have the percentage of participants who complied. So the slight and moderate, you see that basically slight everyone, and then moderate the first 2 stages of the electric shocks, okay? Basically everyone, every of the 40 participants did so. Now you see a drop off, right? Here it basically is like from everyone to 80. Okay, so there's just like, it seems like there's a somewhat, here like 20% of the participants say like, okay, I'm not willing to do this, I'm out. So there are these people who are kind of reluctant, or who can defy the obedience to order. 20%, not a lot, but 20%, and you can see basically there's around between 70 and 80% of the people now conduct the next level of shocks, the ones that are range from strong to intense, okay? So these are labeled where it's like, it's dangerous for the participant, but it's not extremely dangerous. And then finally we look at the results, and you can see there's basically almost no drop-off, okay? When it comes to the highest. So even for extreme intensity, extreme danger, right? When the person was screaming, please, please stop, my heart is bothering. About 64% of the people, not about 64% of the men are still willing to deliver the shock. And you can see there's a slide of from kind of 80 to 64, but more or less everyone who kind of said, and we come back to that, who did not drop off at this stage, kind of continued to the extreme one, right? They hear somebody agonizing scream, and then the experimenter says, you have no choice, you have to continue, and on they go. Quite shocking results. I think our first response is like, I wouldn't do that. I would be obviously among the 20%. This is insane. I think the other insane fact is often somewhat unreported. Without these prompts, right, in a control condition, so the same experiment, but now basically when he turns and looks and asks, hey, this is not right, I don't want to continue, and these prompts don't come, obedience or not obedience, there's no obedience, but the electric shock falls to 3%. Okay, only 3% are now willing to shock to the highest level. So the prompts are what really makes the difference in this experiment, right? It's not that people are willing to shock another person, no, but they're willing to follow orders. And hence this is an experiment about obedience. Without these prompts, people do not continue. They stop very early on, and only 3% continue to the very end. So this is why this is an experiment about obedience and not about like the evil human nature and how we love to shock other people. Somewhere it's like, oh, these were all men. Women have almost literally the same level of obedience. It was in the 70s, it was replicated among many cultures. We come a little bit back to this, who are the people who are more likely, or we come back to this, who are the people more or less likely to follow orders. But you can see that across cultures, that across the genders, you have the same results. It doesn't matter. Men and women are willing to shock in all over, at least in the areas where this experiment was tested, different cultures, same results. It's not just as we had in the beginning, the Germans are obedient or Americans are obedient, right? You would expect if in any culture people are not obedient, then in the US, the most individualistic country in the world. But no, the numbers are almost the same. We are very willing to follow orders. You might feel like maybe things have changed. What about the replication? So obviously, as we come on the next slide, replicating this experiment is very difficult. There are a lot of ethical problems with the study, but one clever way is in a 2009 paper, they replicated this study in the US. And basically what they did is like, okay, you can see that basically this is the crucial step here. This is where most people drop off, okay? So why don't we just kind of stop the experiment here? So our replication will only have these first 3 levels, and that will determine whether we replicate the results or not. So we won't go kind of to these levels. We only will have the first 3 levels because this one is already so strongly predictive of the last step. And this is what Berger and colleagues did, replicating Milgram. Would people still obey today? And the clear answer is yes. So there's a somewhat drop off from 83% to 70%, right? These might have many different reasons. We come back to that in the next chapter. But I mean, you can see it's not like people stopped obeying orders. It's still 70%. So I think it's fair to say that in the 30 or 40 years thereafter, people are still to an almost similar degree willing to obey orders. So this experiment replicates and Milgram himself the different variations with among 1,000 participants and trying to better understand why people obey. And this will be the topic of the next chapter. But before we go to that, we quickly have to talk about, of course, the ethical problems. I think at that time there was no ethics committee that oversaw studies. So here you would see like 3 things we would, as if I used to sit on an ethics committee, if we would be in an ethics committee here in our university, we think about, okay, first of all, there's immense potential for harm for participants. Interestingly, Milgram was really concerned at some point with that too. He followed up with 1,000 participants, and I think only a 1% or a little bit higher than 1% were troubled by what they learned about themselves by this experiment and regretted participating. A lot of them said that they learned something really interesting about themselves. It doesn't seem like there was any kind of psychopathology that developed from these experiments, even though it was extreme in nature and must be maybe one of the most extreme experiences people had, but somehow that didn't. So I think if we would, somebody would come to us with the idea of, hey, I want to do this kind of study, the ethics committee is like, this is insane, you can't do that, there's too much potential for harm for the participant. The other one is like, okay, you have to highlight that at any point you can exit the experiment without any repercussions. So instead, right, in the Milgram ones, like you have to continue. Here the experiment that the scientists say like you can't withdraw. Now this is a standard part of all of our ethical protocols. Anyone participating in any of our study can withdraw at any time without any repercussions. So this is something that's very different today, and it's like one of the lessons from this and other studies. And also you have to kind of give in the beginning an informed consent. This is a little bit tricky. Studies in social psychology still use deception, just as the Milgram study used. So sometimes we tell you not everything that happened, but these studies then are especially scrutinized by the ethics committees of the universities, and it's ensured that the participants are never at any psychological or physical risk. And hence, so this is why I think the replication on the slide before was so interesting, because it's very tricky to replicate such an ethically questionable experiment. Nevertheless, I think Milgram did it for probably another decade, trying to understand why people were so willing to follow the orders of the experimenter, and that is the topic of the next chapter.